Shalom family, this is Elder Uzziah, and today I'm going to show you how to properly count the Passover. The Passover is one of the most sacred high holy days of the entire year, so it's extremely important that you know how to celebrate it. Now earlier this year, we at True Spirit of Christ released a high holy day calendar for 2021, showing our Passover days from April 10th through the 18th. And there's been a lot of questions about when is the Passover and how to properly observe it. So, by the time that you're done watching this lesson, you'll know how to count the days for this year as well as for years to come. Let's begin. So the first question is, when is the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread? The Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover takes place in the first month of the year. When you read in the book of Numbers 28 and 16, it says, "And in the 14th day of the first month is the Passover of the Lord. And in the 15th day of this month is the feast. 7 days shall unleavened bread be eaten. In the first day shall be an holy convocation. Ye shall do no manner of servile work therein." Now this is very important, brothers and sisters. Let's read through this again. In the 14th day of the first month is the Passover of the Lord. And in the 15th day of this month is the feast. This feast is referring to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's why it says as we read on, 7 days shall unleavened bread be eaten. In the first day shall be an holy convocation. Ye shall do no manner of servile work therein. So now you know that the Passover is on the 14th day of the first month. Next, you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which begins on the 15th day. So how can we ensure that we're properly counting this? Well, when you go to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 18, it says, "In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, ye shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even." So as we count from the 14th day all the way through the 21st day, you will notice the span of 8 days. This is letting us know how long it should be from the Passover to the end of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, as you can see, as you count from 14 all the way through 21, this is an 8-day sequence, not 7 days. We have to remember that when we were given the scriptures concerning the Passover was declared on the 14th day of the first month, and the 15th day of the first month begins the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We also see that in Exodus 12 and 18, we were commanded to observe the Passover on the 14th day of the month at even. We would eat unleavened bread all the way through the 21st day. As you count from 14 all the way through 21, you will have 8 days in total. Now you may be asking, well, I always thought that the Passover was a 7-day feast. Why is it now that I'm seeing 8 days on the screen? It's a common myth that Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread Day 1 are merged into one day. The Lord has distinguished the two. That's why he made mention of the 14th day at even versus the 15th day at beyond for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. If you are merging the day of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread into one day, you are missing one day in your observance according to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 18. So let's understand the difference between the 14th day and the 15th day. When you read in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 6, it says, "And ye shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month." This is referring to the Passover lamb. "And the whole assembly of the congregation shall kill it in the evening." Now, one of the things that slips a lot of people up is when they read the word evening in this verse. They already presume that the word evening is making reference to the 15th day. But I want to show you something in the scriptures. If you'll notice on this screen, there's a difference between the word evening in the 6th verse versus the word night in the 8th verse. I'm going to go through a few precepts to help you understand the evening versus the night that was referenced on the 14th day. This is the book of Genesis, chapter 24 and verse 1. And Abraham was old and well stricken in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said unto his eldest servant of his house, that ruled over all that he had, Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven, and the God of the earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. But thou shalt go unto my country and to my kindred, and take a wife unto my son Isaac. So here, Abraham charges his eldest servant to find a wife fit for his son Isaac. When we jump down to the 10th verse, it says, And the servant took 10 camels of the camels of his master, and departed, for all the goods of his master were in his hand. And he arose, and went to Mesopotamia unto the city of Nahor. And he made his camels to kneel down without the city by a well of water at the time of the evening, even the time that women go out to draw water. Now, the question that you have to ask yourself is, if this evening is referring to nightfall, because typically many brothers and many sisters understand the word evening to always mean darkness. If this was referring to the period of darkness in the night, would righteous women go outside to draw water? How could you even see the water outside if it's pitch black? This is not making reference to nightfall. This is talking about an earlier time in the day before it becomes fully dark. Now, when we go to verse 15, it says, And it came to pass, before he had done speaking, that, behold, Rebekah came out, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, with her pitcher upon her shoulder. And the damsel was very fair to look upon, a virgin, neither had any man known her. And she went down to the well and filled her pitcher and came up. Now wait a minute. If the evening was referring to nightfall, how was it that Abraham's oldest servant was able to see what Rebekah looked like? Keep in mind, brothers and sisters, this history that we read about in the book of Genesis was far before electricity. This is thousands of years before electricity had ever come to the earth. So the question is, how was Abraham's oldest servant able to see Rebekah in the evening? It says, And the damsel was very fair to look upon, a virgin, neither had any man known her. And she went down to the well and filled her pitcher and came up. And the servant ran to meet her and said, Let me, I pray thee, drink a little water out of thy pitcher. Again, this is very interesting, because if this was talking about nightfall, why would the servant run up to Rebekah? If somebody were to run up to you in the nightfall, do you think that you would have a good exchange? No. Chances are, if somebody ran up to you at nightfall, you'd be thinking they are coming to rob or to kill you. So this is showing that this was during an hour while there was still sunlight outside. There was still enough visibility so that Rebekah could see the servant could see Rebekah, and they could deal with one another in a peaceable fashion as Rebekah had drawn water from the well. Next is the law of uncleanness in Deuteronomy 23. This is the book of Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 10. It reads, If there be among you any man that is not clean by reason of uncleanness that chanceth him by night, then shall he go abroad out of the camp. He shall not come within the camp, but it shall be, when evening cometh on, he shall wash himself with water. And when the sun is down, he shall come into the camp again. Now, I want to explain this because when we're reading about this law of uncleanness, it's talking about a man having what's known in the modern day as a wet dream. That's why it says, not clean by reason of uncleanness that chanceth him by night. So a man goes to sleep, he has a wet dream, he wakes up and notices that he's unclean. It says, then shall he go abroad out of the camp. He shall not come within the camp. Why? Because he's unclean. It says, but it shall be when evening cometh on, he shall wash himself with water. So the law was that during the evening time, this man that was defiled would be outside of the camp washing himself until the night. It says, but it shall be when evening cometh on, he shall wash himself with water. And when the sun is down, he shall come into the camp again. This verse clearly shows that evening, according to this context, is making reference to a time period where there is still sunlight outside. As you can see in the middle of the 11th verse, there's a colon that's used to further explain the reference of the evening. It says, but it shall be when evening cometh on, he shall wash himself with water, colon. And when the sun is down, meaning further explaining this particular time period. And when the sun is down, he shall come into the camp again. So it was not until the sun was down, after the evening, that this man was able to go back into the camp. During the evening, he was still outside of the camp washing himself with water. In Proverbs 7:6, it says, for at the window of my house I looked through my casement, and beheld among the simple ones, I discerned among the youths a young man void of understanding. Now wait a minute. How could Solomon see through his window if outside it was pitch black? For at the window of my house I looked through my casement, and beheld among the simple ones. To behold means to see. I discerned among the youths a young man void of understanding, passing through the street near her corner. And he went the way to her house. In the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark night. So Solomon is giving you a time mark of when he's looking out of the window. He's able to see a young man through his casement in the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark night. And behold, again, meaning see, to look at. Behold, there met him a woman with the attire of a harlot, and subtle of heart. So Solomon was able to see what this woman was wearing, showing that there was enough sunlight outside to still be able to see. Now I want to go back to this 9th verse when it references in the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark night. The operative word is twilight, because whenever we hear the word evening, or when we think about the black and dark night, we often presume that this is talking about a time where it is pitch black. In astronomy, you have what is known as a civil twilight, a nautical twilight, and an astronomical twilight. These are different levels of light that provides a contrast from the daylight to darkness. It doesn't just go from bright day to gross darkness, brothers and sisters. There has to be a regression of light all the way from its highest peak to the lowest point of the night. That's why you can see in this second illustration from Earth Hour 2008, there's a distinct difference between the civil twilight, the nautical twilight, and the astronomical twilight. In a civil twilight, you can still see outside, although it is sunset. During this time, it says the sky is bright, particularly in a western direction. A few of the brightest stars can be seen in the east. We can see clearly outdoors without artificial light. So for our forefathers who did not have access to artificial light, this is the period of time that they were referencing when we read earlier regarding the evening. It was a time period in which it was getting darker than daylight. However, it was not pitch black. You were still able to be outside and you were able to see other people clearly. So in summary, the evening time that we've been reading about was a time period in which you could see. This is the reason why Rebekah was able to go out and draw water at this time. The nighttime that we read about back in Exodus was referring to a period of darkness. This is why the Lord led our forefathers by night in a pillar of fire in order to give us light. We needed a pillar of fire because this was a time in the night in which we could not see. So I pray that you understand the difference between evening versus night. Back to Exodus 12. This is the book of Exodus chapter 12 and verse 6. And ye shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month. And the whole assembly of the congregation shall kill it in the evening. So now that we understand that this evening is making reference to the twilight, now we understand how our foreparents were able to kill the lamb. They were able to kill the lamb because they could see it. Notice how the verse says that the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel would kill the Passover. How could the whole congregation kill the lamb if this is late at night? The elderly of our people wouldn't have been able to see. Our righteous foremothers would not have been out at night. It was always a custom for them to be in the house. We needed sunlight in order to kill the lamb. Then in verse 7 it says, and they shall take of the blood and strike it on the two side posts and on the upper doorposts of the houses, wherein they shall eat. So they needed enough time to not only kill the lamb, but to take of the blood and strike it on the side posts of all of the houses where our foreparents dwelled. Then later on it says, and they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. So this is letting you know that there is a clear time difference from the time when the animal was kept up to the evening until the time that it was eaten in that night, because there was already so much time that had passed from the whole assembly of the congregation coming together, taking the blood, putting it on the houses, going into the houses, cooking and eating the Passover meal. This is the reason why the scriptures make a distinction between in the evening in verse 6 and in that night in verse 8. In the evening is making reference to the 14th day at evening time. In that night is making reference to the 15th day of the month, which also begins the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is the reason why in many cultures outside of the United States, they often have common greetings that will say good evening as well as good night. They understand there's a difference between the two. Now here's what we notice about the 15th day. In Exodus chapter 12 and verse 17 it says, and ye shall observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. Notice when we're told to observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread. For in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. When were we brought out of the land of Egypt? Were we brought out on the 14th day or were we brought out on the 15th day? Remember, brothers and sisters, we were still in Egypt preparing the Passover lamb all the way up to the evening of the 14th day. We were still in our homes at night. When you read in the scriptures, it wasn't until after midnight had passed that Pharaoh and other Egyptians woke up wailing because all of the 10 plagues were being sent throughout the houses of the Egyptians. So this is letting you know that when we're commanded to observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever, we're commanded to observe the 15th day to begin the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Not the 14th day, the 15th day, which was the selfsame day that the Lord brought our armies out of the land of Egypt. This would be a day of observance in our generation by an ordinance forever. So now you can see that we're able to reconcile the days that we were commanded to keep from the 15th day of the month all the way to the 21st day of the month at even. The difference from 15 to 21 is 7 days. This represents that 7-day feast that the Lord was talking about. We would begin to have unleavened bread on the evening of the 14th day. We would have the Passover meal later that night. And then from the 15th day all the way through the 21st day, that represents the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So to be clear, the Passover, which falls on the 14th day of the month, is not a Sabbath. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, which begins on the 15th day, is a Sabbath. When I say Sabbath, I'm referring to the time period in which you cannot buy, sell, and work. We were able to buy and sell and perform our labors on the 14th day, but we were not able to buy and sell on the 15th day. That's why it says in Leviticus 23 and verse 5, in the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread unto the Lord. 7 days ye must eat unleavened bread. The 14th day is not the same as the 15th day. These are two distinctly different time periods. The 14th day at even is making reference to the civil twilight, nautical twilight, and astronomical twilight that we spoke about earlier. The 15th day begins at night in darkness. That's why it says in verse 6, and on the 15th day, meaning in addition to what has already come before it, which was the 14th day at even, and on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread unto the Lord. 7 days ye must eat unleavened bread. In the first day ye shall have an holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein. What is it talking about when it talks about the first day? It's talking about the first day of the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Feast of Unleavened Bread begins on the 15th day of the month. Notice how this sentence came immediately after talking about the 15th day rather than immediately following any discussion on the 14th day. Why? Because Moses is noting that this Sabbath begins on the 15th day, not the 14th. In verse 8 it says, but ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord 7 days. In the 7th day is an holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein. Now this would make sense because on the 14th day, we were commanded to make ready the Passover meal. So imagine if you're trying to prepare the Passover meal, this means that you may need to go out and get unleavened bread. You may need to go out and prepare to have water. You may need to get the essentials that you need to put this meal together because this is a time of preparation. It is not a Sabbath. So as you can see from our High Holy Day calendar, we have Passover officially noted on Saturday, April 10th, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread will go all the way through Sunday, April 18th. We reach these days because the full moon, also known as the new moon in the scriptures, takes place on March 28th. This is the first full moon of the spring season. We must remember that Passover begins in spring. 14 days after the spring full moon takes us to Saturday, April 10th. This is the beginning of the 14th day. As you know from Genesis 1, the nighttime represents a new day. So Passover, the 14th day, starts the evening of April 10th all the way through the evening of April 11th. The evening of April 11th brings us to the evening of the 14th day. The night of April 11th brings us to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, day 1. Then we go from day 2 to day 3 to day 4, all the way through April 18th, which is the final evening of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, day 7 at evening, also known as the evening of the 21st day. So we went through the Passover in the Old Testament by going to the law in Numbers, Exodus, and Leviticus. Now I want to show you how Passover was observed in the New Testament. This is Matthew chapter 26 and verse 17. Now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? Now, if you notice at the beginning of this verse, it says, now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. One thing that confuses a lot of people is when the New Testament uses the words Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread interchangeably. When they read that, they think that the Passover, which is on the 14th day, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is on the 15th day, is all the same. In Matthew 26 and 17, it's referring to the season in which these holy days are happening. Let's go to Acts chapter 12 and verse 1 to prove that Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread are being used interchangeably. This is Acts chapter 12 and verse 1. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James the brother of John with the sword. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread. And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Now, I just read that in the King James Version. And you'll notice that in verse 3, it says, then were the days of unleavened bread. The days of unleavened bread is a 7-day time period. But notice in the 4th verse, it says, and when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Now, for some of you who may be viewing this from the Christian church, you may be unaware that the word Easter here is a misprint for the Passover. This is the reason why I've provided the NIV version so that you could see that Passover was properly referenced in other translations. We all know from reading Leviticus 23 that the Passover is prior to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. However, the New Testament mentions these titles interchangeably because they're all happening within the same season. It's all going down within the same time period. So we as believers must remember that even though the New Testament is speaking on these feast days broadly, technically the Passover is on the 14th day and the Feast of Unleavened Bread includes the 15th day and beyond. And just for reference, for our congregation here at the True Spirit of Christ, we'll be gathering together in a holy convocation for the weekly Sabbath on Saturday, April the 10th, and we will also begin our Passover festivities Sunday evening. This is consistent with how our forefathers did things in the Old Testament, keeping the lamb up until the evening of the 14th day, and then partaking in the Passover meal later that night. So now we go back to Matthew 26, verse 17, and it reads, Now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? In Matthew 26, verse 19, it says, And the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover. Now when the even was come, he sat down with the 12. So we clearly see Christ himself observed the Passover. It also reads in John chapter 18 and verse 4, Jesus therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? We'll address this further as we outline the sequence of Christ's crucifixion. For now, as we focus on the Passover, I want you to notice the series of events that took place. When Christ observed the Passover, that night which began the 14th day, Christ prophesied his betrayal. He sat down with the 12 to eat the Passover meal. Then after, they went to the Mount of Olives. During that time, Christ prophesied that Peter would deny him thrice. During that time, Judas Iscariot came with officers and betrayed Christ, having him arrested. The following morning, Christ was delivered unto Pontius Pilate. Judas Iscariot hanged himself out of grief and guilt, and Pontius Pilate called a release of a prisoner during the feast. Now in Matthew 27:15 it reads, Now at that feast the governor was wont to release unto the people a prisoner, whom they would. When you read the 16th verse, it tells you that prisoner was Barabbas. What I want you to focus on is in verse 15 when it says, Now at that feast. What is this referring to? This is the Passover. All of this was happening on the 14th day. In Matthew chapter 27 and verse 46 it reads, And about the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Some of them that stood there, when they heard that, said, This man calleth for Elijah. And straightway one of them ran, and took a sponge, and filled it with vinegar, and put it on a reed, and gave him to drink. The rest said, Let be, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. So we can see from these verses that Christ perished around 3 p.m. I've provided you a visual reference of the biblical time clock when it's talking about the 9th hour. The 9th hour biblically represents 3 p.m. because it is 9 hours after sunrise, which typically begins around 6 a.m. Now when we read in Matthew 27 verse 57, it says, When the even was come, there came a rich man of Arimathea, named Joseph, who also himself was Jesus' disciple. He went to Pilate and begged the body of Jesus. Then Pilate commanded the body to be delivered. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre, and departed. And there was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary sitting over against the sepulchre. So I want you to keep all of this in mind. We're still in the 14th day, where Christ has been delivered unto Pilate. Judas hanged himself. Pilate released Barabbas. Christ is crucified around 3 p.m. Now here, it's important to note that Christ was crucified during the Passover. That's why the scriptures tell us that Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. If you're wondering why Christ and the 12 had their Passover meal at the beginning of the 14th day, Christ knew that he would be crucified on the Passover. Remember what we read earlier in John 18:4. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? Now, after Christ is crucified on the Passover, Joseph of Arimathea, one of Christ's disciples, begs for the body of Christ. Pilate approves this, and then Joseph wraps him in fine linen, placing him in the sepulchre. Remember, all of this took place during the Passover. All of the Gospels confirm this account. You can read it in Matthew 26 and 27, John 19, as well as Luke, the 22nd chapter, as well as Mark chapter 14 and 15. Now, all of these things happened on this particular day because the 14th day, also known as the Passover, is a day of preparation, not a Sabbath. Remember what we read in Matthew 26 and 17. Now, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? In Matthew 27, verse 62, it reads, Now the next day that followed the day of the preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees came together unto Pilate. In John chapter 19 and verse 30, it says, When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, It is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Remember, this happened on the 14th day, also known as the Passover. Verse 31, The Jews therefore, because it was the preparation that the bodies should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day, for that Sabbath day was an high day, besought Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So as we can see, brothers and sisters, as we read in the New Testament, the 14th day of the first month was regarded as a day of preparation. The 14th day was not a Sabbath. They were preparing to observe the 15th day as a Sabbath. It reads, The Jews therefore, because it was the preparation that the bodies should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day, for that Sabbath day was an high day. This is where you need to know the history in order to understand that you could not have a dead body on a cross during the Sabbath. This proves that this 14th day was not viewed by our foreparents as a Sabbath. In fact, they were rushing to get Christ's body off the cross because they knew they had to have him buried prior to the 15th day, which begins the Sabbath. This high day is referring to the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's not talking about the weekly Sabbath, which takes place from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. Now, I know you might be thinking, but Uzziah, are you sure that the 14th day is not a Sabbath? This is a weighty matter, and I don't know if my conscience is fully persuaded in the scriptures. No problem. Let's read Mark chapter 15 and verse 43. Joseph of Arimathea, an honorable counselor, which also waited for the kingdom of God, came and went in boldly unto Pilate, and craved the body of Jesus. And Pilate marveled if he were already dead, and calling unto him the centurion, he asked him whether he had been any while dead. And when he knew it of the centurion, he gave the body to Joseph. And he bought fine linen, and took him down, and wrapped him in the linen, and laid him in a sepulchre which was hewn out of a rock, and rolled a stone unto the door of the sepulchre. And Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph beheld where he was laid. Now wait a minute. If the 14th day is a Sabbath, why is Joseph of Arimathea buying fine linen? Who's selling it to him? There's not supposed to be any businesses open during the Sabbath. Surely not for the Lord's high day, for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is letting you know that the 14th day is not a Sabbath. People were still doing their bidding, going to and fro, but they were rushing in preparation for the Sabbath to come. Now, brothers and sisters, this bears repeating. Joseph of Arimathea, who bought the fine linen, is one of Christ's disciples. Surely, if anybody would know which day is a Sabbath and which one is not, it would be one of Christ's disciples. Surely Christ's own disciple would not defile the Lord's high holy day by selling or buying on an illegal day in honor of Christ. Joseph of Arimathea did not defile the Sabbath because on this particular day, buying was permitted. Now again, oftentimes when people read the word Sabbath, they automatically presume that it's making reference to the seventh-day Sabbath from Friday to Saturday. That's not what this is talking about in Mark 16:1. Mark 16:1 reads, "And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him." This Sabbath that had passed was after the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Feast of Unleavened Bread opener represents a high day according to the scriptures. They had to wait until this day was done because they could not buy on the Sabbath. Now remember from the history that we read earlier, our forefathers were rushing to get Christ's body off the cross before the Sabbath. Joseph of Arimathea bought linen on the evening of the 14th day, and Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, was with him when they went to the sepulchre. They did not have time to buy and prepare spices. They had to wait until the Feast of Unleavened Bread opener was over. So now when we get to Luke chapter 23 and verse 54, where it reads, "And that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. And the women also, which came with him from Galilee, followed after and beheld the sepulchre and how his body was laid. And they returned and prepared spices and ointments and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment." What this is saying, brothers and sisters, is that the 54th verse that we're reading, when it says, "And that day was the day of preparation and the Sabbath drew on," that was making reference to the 14th day, which is also technically the Passover. That was the preparation day. The 15th day was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where we would eat the Passover meal that night. We read in the 55th verse where it talks about the women also, which came with him from Galilee, followed after. The him was Joseph of Arimathea. They beheld the sepulchre and how his body was laid. This was right before the Feast of Unleavened Bread Sabbath began. And they returned. See, this is the point where time has passed. They had to wait until after the start of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, according to Mark 16:1. And then after that Sabbath was done, they bought and prepared spices and ointment, and they rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. Meaning, they bought and prepared the spices on Friday. The 15th day of the month, which also represents the Feast of Unleavened Bread beginning, was from Wednesday evening to Thursday evening. Businesses reopened Friday morning. This is when Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, went and bought the spices. They spent the rest of the day preparing the spices, and they finished up with it before the seventh-day Sabbath began that Friday evening. We must keep in mind, brothers and sisters, when it comes to our foremothers preparing spices and ointments, they did not have food processors like what we have today. They did not have these 24-hour businesses because merchants traditionally closed down during nighttime. So it took a period of time for all of these things to take place. They witnessed the death and crucifixion of Christ Wednesday afternoon. Wednesday evening to Thursday evening was the Sabbath. Friday morning, they bought the spices, prepared it for the remainder of the day until the end of Friday evening, which then began the 7-day Sabbath. They rested from Friday to Saturday, visited Christ's tomb early Sunday, and by the time they had gotten there while it was still dark, Christ was already risen. Christ had already fulfilled the prophecy that he spoke of in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 40. For as Jonas was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And as you can see from our visual reference, if Mary Magdalene and the other Mary had went to the sepulchre by first thing Sunday, this shows us that Christ was risen on Saturday. They went specifically at this time, early Sunday morning, to verify whether or not his prophecy was true. This was one of the many signs that Christ is the Messiah, based upon his declaration that he would be out of the heart of the earth after 3 days and 3 nights. So if we know that Christ was risen on Saturday, we simply have to count in reverse. And for your convenience, we've already put the chart together, showing the chronology of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. So as you can see, on Tuesday evening, Christ and the disciples ate the Passover meal. This marked the beginning of the 14th day. Later that night, Christ was betrayed, and the following morning, he was delivered to Pontius Pilate. Around 3 p.m., Christ gives up the ghost and passes away. Our forefathers are rushing to get him off the cross to bury him just before night. Because Christ was buried in the evening, just before night, this begins the prophecy of night 1. Night 1 begins on Wednesday. Night 2 begins on Thursday. Night 3 begins on Friday. He's already risen by Saturday night. Likewise, since the prophecy started with night, the following morning begins day 1. Thursday is day 1, Friday is day 2, Saturday is day 3. So brothers and sisters, this is how we know which day is the proper day to observe the Sabbath. As we look through the chronology of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, it reveals to us that the 14th day was a day of preparation, and the 15th day was a high Sabbath to bring in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is consistent in what we read in the law of Moses. So from henceforth, we should all know that the 14th day, which begins the Passover, is in addition to the 7 feast days that comes directly after with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is why we have counted from April 10th to April 18th when charting the Passover. This allows us 1 day from the 10th through the 11th for a time of preparation, beginning the Sabbath on the night of the 11th. And as we count 7 biblical days from the evening of Sunday, April the 11th, all the way through April 18th, we will have reached 7 days of feasting and gladness. So brothers and sisters, I pray that you were edified from today's lesson. If you liked this video and would like to see more breakdowns from True Spirit of Christ, please go ahead and smash that thumbs up button. This will help us preach the gospel throughout the 4 corners of the earth. Please don't forget to subscribe to our True Spirit of Christ YouTube channel, and please follow us on our Facebook page. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave a comment below and we'll be sure to check it out. And from all of us at True Spirit of Christ, we wish you a very blessed Passover, and may many blessings come to you and your household.